Hey folks, so I know I posted the assignment um, 5 to the website and a video that introduces it, and now I'm going to post the review of the videos for assignment 4. So I have mine here. I'm going to try to go video by video, and I'll probably just put like the video I'm looking at down here and tell you what questions I'm going over. So yeah. First video, want to try to do it quickly, is the video The Atlantic Slave Trade by Ted Ed. So question number 1, why were Africans enslaved by Europeans? And the key answer there was there was not enough labor to meet the demand for the cash crops in Europe. So you had all these plantations growing these things, and the demand was so high for all of them that there wasn't enough people to work the farms and the plantations, so they turned to Africa for slaves, because the native population, Native Americans in what is now the United States, were dying because of the European diseases. So not enough labor. Number 2, had Africans who enslaved other Africans review those who they sold into slavery. They saw them as criminals, debtors, and prisoners of war, which is important because that idea comes up later. Question 3, why did slavery soon become a motivation for war? What did African kings want? The kings, of course, they wanted money. And Europeans wanted the slaves, so you could, if you have a higher slave, if you have more people to sell into slavery, you can get more money back. So it created this vicious cycle. So kings needed slaves to sell to the Europeans because the demand for slaves was so high, because the demands for crops was so high. And the Europeans would trade weapons to the African kings in exchange for slaves, enslaved people. And the African kings essentially started to say, okay, if I have these weapons, I can go attack another kingdom, take over that kingdom, and take those people, mostly the men, take them as prisoners, and then sell them to the Europeans as slaves. So basically wars were fought to capture people and then turn them into slaves. And it created this cycle. So kings needed slaves to get weapons, and then so they can fight wars, and if you didn't have the weapons, then you could be taken over and your kingdom could be turned into like slaves. So it's this crazy, wicked cycle of weaponry and lack of weapons would turn into slaves, and so you created this gigantic system of war for enslaving people. It's crazy. Question 4, the African slave trade was a deeply inhumane act. Some examples, 20% of those who were captured wouldn't even make it to the United States. They would die in the transit process. Captured Africans were shaved and branded, very cattle-like. Enslaved people were crammed below deck. You'll see in another video kind of the conditions of those things. Enslaved people were thrown overboard if they were sick, so you don't infect others, or for a disciplinary measure. So if you're causing issues, they would just throw you overboard. And men were made to perform dances to keep them physically fit, and then also they would cut off the ears as proof of purchase to make sure that the captured enslaved person makes it onto the ship and then makes it off the ship into the United States. Question number 5. What was the impact of slave trade, or what were the impacts of slave trade on Africa after slave trade ended in the Americas? Loss of millions of population, especially the male population. The economies of African kingdoms collapsed, causing the poorer kingdoms to be then taken over by the wealthier kingdoms. And then you had the European weapons were just left there, so then you had this increase in warfare and competition over limited sources. So if your kingdom had money and weapons, you could take over other kingdoms. And 6, so Europeans are religious, but how do these extremely religious people, in fact, justify enslaving other people? So if you believe in God and all these things, how do you go about enslaving people? Well, they turned it into they turned this whole way of thinking into racism. They believed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves. Um, so this is clearly connected to number two, where African kings saw people who were slaves as criminals, debtors, and prisoners of war. There was no race in the origin for how other African kings thought of their slaves. They just thought that it was a form of punishment, essentially. But Europeans and white Europeans, white slave owners, they turned it into race because they were religious. They couldn't stand being hypocrites, so they created the idea of racism, saying that Africans were just made to be slaves and they were inferior, so therefore it's okay for Europeans to enslave Africans. It's like so like that. Like if you really think about it, it's like mind blowing. The impact of it, still on number 6, was that the origin, that racist theory that Africans were biologically inferior, trickled into the United States, obviously, and it made slavery a deeper system because now it has these social components. And the fight against slavery was now not just a fight to free those who are enslaved, but it's also to fight against racism. So now you've created two battles essentially that have to be fought. One against the idea of slavery, and then the other, which is still being fought out today, is the idea against this racism that this whole thing created. So it made it like extremely more complicated. So, moving on to the second video. Alright, so now we're on to the roots video 1, the middle passage. Okay, hopefully I'll try to make it a little faster. Question 1, the difference between American slavery and African slavery, just like we talked about. For Africans who enslaved other Africans, it was a form of punishment, and for American slavery, it was racism. Okay, so punishment for Africans enslaving Africans, Americans enslaving Africans was racism. Number 2, 12.5 million is the number of people removed from Africa for slavery, roughly. Okay. Question 3, shocking conditions of the middle passage. You could have anything from it lasted 2 to 3 months. Men and women were separate. The enslaved Africans were kept below deck, where the ceiling was 4 feet high. So they were crammed, hunched over. Men were shackled together and lied down next to each other. You saw it in the video. For the whole length of the journey. And I think the most, the disorienting part is that, you may have not speak English, so you're being captured by these white people who, they even thought that they were like cannibals. They had no idea who these people were. You were being captured, and then you were being put on a ship, and then you ended up somewhere a totally different part of the world. Like, you were so disoriented in the sense of what is going on. It's like this abduction, and you're put into this other horrible system. So, just like, to think about it, to really sit with that is incredible. Video 2, the slave auction, okay? So Americans knew, so question 1, how did Americans know a new slave ship was coming? Was the smell, okay? You could smell it a day ahead if the winds were blowing it in, smell like the septic tank. Question 2, descriptive language. They use things like lusty, prime, and fresh cargo. Very like items and like meat and like shipment. It was very just disturbing. The prices. So question 3, men's price was the age. It was based off of age. About 25 to 30 were like that was the prime prime. That was the most expensive enslaved African, and they would cost. This video says a cost of around a car is one slave or enslaved person. And then question 4: prices were different for enslaved women. Women, it wasn't really by age; it was by perceived. So it was years of remaining fertility. So how many years left in order for them to become pregnant do they have? And that's, if you had more years to become pregnant, you were more expensive. And attractiveness. And I think the end part of this video is super powerful because, or impactful, because it was, slavery did have this, like, white slave owners did have this sexual desire piece, which is more disturbing and so complicated. So it was this, slave owners also wanted an access to sex, and that was a deep thing in their thinking. And to think that, if you have the racism combined with it, it's so complicated to try and truly understand these slave owners' justifications, which is what we're going to be doing soon. But you had these sexual desires of slave owners that was so disturbing and horrifying as part of the motivation for buying an enslaved person. So deeply, deeply disturbing. Video 3, okay, the system of American slavery. Question 1, this is complicated. The amount of enslaved Africans in the United States was 15 to 20% of the total wealth of the country, okay? The enslaved population was, that population was worth more than all the factories up north. Like, combined, the slave population they were more valuable than every factory and everything those factories made up north. That is bonkers crazy. This video says by 1850, one enslaved person cost between $230,000 to $250,000 if you adjust it. That is, like, it shows you that there were a certain group of people that were in charge, that were really creating this slave culture. But all of this is terrifying because you're putting a price on a human. Like, you are finally pricing out what is a human life worth. It's so, oh man, it blows my mind. In a bad way, just, yeah. Question 2, slavery became so ingrained in Southern society because slavery was so tied to the economy. The South would not have been remotely economically successful if there was no enslaved population. So they created a society that was just based around slavery because it was so important economically. And then they limited slave trade, so then slaves became inheritable. Your slave status became inheritable. Whereas in Africa, slaves were seen as, remember, debtors, criminals, or prisoners of war that was not passed on to their children. In America, they created the system that the child of a enslaved person, was also to be an enslaved person. So those people were born into slavery. And that they created that in order to preserve slavery because it was so tied to their economic wealth. Like, oh my God, that's just crazy to think of. And it lasted so long. Yeah, geez. Question 3. Free black people were required to move out of the state within 90 days if they somehow gained their freedom. Why? And the big thing was that if enslaved people saw a free black person, it would give those enslaved people hope that they could in fact become free. And that therefore free black people were seen as dangerous. They didn't want to give enslaved people any form of hope. That's a whole other layer of this trauma. like truly vindictive and psychologically horrifying that you have to kick out free black people because you don't want to give hope to your enslaved population. That's horrifying and evil. Evil. So, last video, families in slavery. Question 1, chattel slavery. It was basically the style that existed in the United States. It was just known as chattel slavery instead of like prisoner of war slavery. Meant that enslaved people were the personal property of slave owners. Okay. Box 1 says, why did this allow slave owners, or what did this allow slave owners to do? It allowed slave owners to treat these people as property. So they were allowed legally to beat enslaved people, torture them in any form of punishment. Like they would sell family members, rip families apart, all legally. So, for example, if you saw the video, a slave would run away, or an enslaved person would run away, and if they were captured, you may have a toe chopped off or a foot chopped off. Something like so. And then the other side of question 1 is, what did this prevent enslaved people from doing? Enslaved people could not take a master to court, so for any of the punishments, you couldn't take masters to court. Enslaved people could not serve on a jury, so there was no representation. And then enslaved people could not testify. The idea of justice for enslaved populations was not only not existent, but it was prevented. Enslaved population had no chance to earn or find any form of justice legally. It was prevented. Last question. Why is it so important to remember that enslaved people lived their lives in families? So the whole system of enslaving people is inhumane. Okay, you strip them of everything: their rights, their freedoms, their lives is drastically reduced and turned into this violent thing, and psychologically horrifying thing. So it's important to remember that enslaved people lived in families because it was their form of opposing what the video said is their commodification. So commodification is when you make something an item and then you put a price on it and you sell it. So by remembering that they lived in families reminds us now in the 21st century that they were still people, and it was a little bit of their form of resistance to opposing the idea that they are property and not people. They were human. And the family, so that it was another form of kind of helping them heal. So family ties that existed in American slavery were to help replace what was lost when Africans were ripped apart from their families. So you created family ties here, and family became so important for enslaved people because families may have been torn apart when they were back in Africa, or even when they're sold. So you form new family and you have strong family ties. I hope you got to at least try the discussion board at the bottom of the questions. You click that link and try to post. Try to do it just so we have if there's another avenue if we're shifting more to virtual. So please try that. I'm sorry this was 20 minutes, but it's the review. And coming up next, one of the assignments may actually be a video on how to make a Google Drive, so you can just share your work through Google Drive. This way, instead of having it lost via email, I can kind of check to see how we're doing by just accessing your Google Drive and then clicking through the assignments. I hope you are remaining safe, you're remaining happy, and you're washing hands and taking care of families, and yeah, just remember this work will help us progress forward and if we return, you will be completed. Yeah, it's complicated. I'll explain and provide more information when we have more information. But thank you for completing the work and staying on task. It means a lot to me, and it's a good break from the world today. So, be good and stay safe.